Greetings, my name is Dr. Ty-Ria Jenkins, and today's presentation will be over my formative assessment data review. The learning outcomes for this session was for the team to be able to lead with knowledge of how to analyze student work samples and be able to determine what strengths and weaknesses um, were there, in addition to being able to evaluate and reflect on their practices during their instructional delivery of the content, looking at the types of questions that were seen on the assessment, seeing if rigor matched, and if it didn't match, what would be the next steps, and lastly, developing next steps for how they will support students who didn't quite master the standards and those students who also needed enrichment opportunities. The structure of this presentation will be first reviewing the composition of the formative, how it was created, the types of questions, the standards that was assessed, in addition to the different type of item types that students may have seen. Then we'll transition into data analysis, looking at the students and their performance on the assessment, looking at any trends, or were there any questions that all students got right, all students got wrong, were there any questions that provided areas for teachers to strategically plan for based off of how it was asked. And lastly, looking closely at what could be next steps in terms of providing supports to those students who need it in terms of enrichment opportunities, in terms of reteaching, those students who just need more practice with being able to see problems or item types of that nature. The formative assessment that I chose for this presentation that I worked with teachers on was for third grade quarter 2A assessment. For this assessment, it was composed of 12 questions that were interleaved with the following standards of 3 PAFR 1.2, 1.3, and 2.1. With 3 PAFR 1.2 being multiplied whole numbers, factors 0 through 10, and dividing whole numbers, divisors 1 through 10, using a model and writing a corresponding equation. With 3 PAFR 1.3 being multiplying two whole numbers from 0 to 10 and divide using related flexibility and accuracy. And lastly, 3 PFR 2.1, which is determine the unknown whole number in a multiplication or division real world situation, relating three whole numbers when the unknown is a missing factor, product, dividend, divisor, or quotient. The item types in which students would see these questions asked was mirrored off of the SC-rated state assessments that students see in the spring, to include item types that were selected response, multi-select, and technology enhanced. What you see reflected on your screen is the data from one of the third grade classes. Out of this class, there were 29 students. 28 students were able to take the assessment. Out of those 28 students, as you can see, 75% of those students made between the average of 65 to 100%. The other 25% made between the percentage of 0 to 64%, with one of those students not being tested. As a guiding resource, the following data reflection tool was provided by the principal for teachers to use. This tool was to be pre-completed prior to coming into the data analysis for teachers to have a look at their data, to look at the performance level in which each student scored, in addition to answering some key questions that will give them more insight into what misconceptions were there any strengths, were there any weaknesses, some reflection questions as to what could they do better in terms of providing support to those students who don't have it, in addition to what will be some actionable next steps that they think that they will be able to get accomplished after reviewing the data. The following question that you see on the screen is a question that all of the students got right. So this question had 100% accuracy. When reviewing the question with the third grade team and asking them what did they think made students most successful with this question, the teachers shared that they think that the visual was key and students being able to get the answer correct. This type of question was asked in the format of a drop down. So where you see it says the multiplication sentence and then it has that arrow, it was a drop down. And students were to select the multiplication sentence that matched the skateboards, which was the three groups of five. So it's 3 times 5 equals 15 was that correct answer. Teachers did share with me that during the lesson, as they have been working on multiplication, they worked a lot with groups of and showing students how to model that. In addition to, they have been also using arrays and talking about how that correlates to multiplication. So they did credit a lot of that accuracy of students within the class to them feeling comfortable with being able to work within arrays and identifying the groups and identifying how many in each groups and being able to find that product. The next question that you see is one that also received a high amount of accuracy, being at 96%. For this question, students were to do key entry input, so they actually had to use the keypad to enter in a number that fit within the multiplication equation to solve it with the caterpillars. When talking and reflecting with teachers as well for this problem, something that they thought was key was having that picture as a reminder and having those circles to indicate the groups and having students be able to kind of model multiplication questions when they just see the numbers and having them to draw pictures if that helps them. They credited that a lot to why they felt that it was a lot of accuracy in this question. And actually, for the couple of students who did get this one correct, they just transposed the actual product and the factor. So that was something neat to be able to look at when looking at the data and looking more specifically at how the students answered the question, with seeing that they did have the correct numbers, but in terms of where they put them, the placement was off. So that was something that teachers talked about, being able to be intentional about when also ensuring that they were knowing that, it's two factors are multiplied together to get a product, and the product is more than the factors. So that was key in looking at that question and seeing how we could support those students who didn't quite get it right, but did actually have the number. So, being strategic about how we can support those to get them where they needed to be as well. The question you see below also had high accuracy, with 93% of students being able to get it correct. Teachers did attribute that accuracy also to being able to have a picture that helped reinforce the groups and also that product. And students were able to arrive at that answer with the three groups of four being 12. Similar to the last question, we have question 4, which had the paper clips. On this question, it received 57% accuracy. Notice a difference in this one, although it did have a picture as an aid, has select all that apply. So it wasn't just a single select question, it was a multi-select question. And when talking with teachers and looking at the answers that students chose, what we saw was that students chose one answer, and it was generally one of the right answers. However, they didn't choose all that apply, so the whole question was marked incorrect. So when talking with teachers about what could be next steps in terms of how will we help students who didn't get this question correct, one of the teachers was able to say, really they have the understanding of what it is in terms of groups of, They've also reviewed with them repeated additions, so they're not thinking that that was the actual issue. It's more so of them actually reading the question and gaining understanding of what it's asking you to do. So they talked about being more intentional with test taking strategies and making sure that when they see select all that apply, that they underline it, and then they actually go through each answer and see if it does match without just stopping at the first one that's correct, because there may be more that are able to reflect. So it was nice to see them kind of come together and be able to share, hey, sometimes it's not all about the process of how to get to the correct answer. Sometimes it's also about them actually making meaning of what the question is asking, and then also being able to review with them test taking strategies that help them navigate and be able to know what it's asking so that they're able to get the question correct. As you can see below, this question did not receive high accuracy. Only 61% of students were able to get this question correct. When looking at the data and drilling down and looking more specific at students' individual responses, what we noticed was that the students who did not get it correct used all of the number of sentences and placed them in the boxes even when they didn't fit. Something that we discussed as a team was being more intentional about talking about test taking strategies in terms of looking at the answers and knowing that, hey, sometimes it may not fit within a particular box or it may not match. And just because it's there, you don't have to use it. So ensuring that we're having those conversations so that students are aware just because it's an option that is not being used. Something else that was shared in terms of insight was when this was covered within the instruction and students were to do fact family, it was more so a fill in the blank or um, them actually doing like a fact house type thing to for them to show their mastery and understanding of fact family, but they never saw it in terms of a drag and drop type question. Actually, one teacher shared with me that they hadn't did any questions that required them to kind of sort in a drag and drop type motion. So that was some key insight to teachers being able to give students diverse ways of being able to see questions to see if they can still answer them correctly, especially since these are some type item type problems that students will see like drag and drop on their state assessment. So the team talked about being more intentional about providing opportunities for students to see questions that required them to do drag and drop, in addition to also making sure that they're reviewing those test taking skills of knowing that just because the answer is there, it doesn't mean that it actually fits and that you actually have to see if it's fit in that rule for what you're sorting it for. Lastly, this question below also received low accuracy, with 68% of students being able to get it correct. Something that we noticed when looking at individual students and how they responded for the ones who did not get it correct was that they didn't understand the question completely. They looked at the dogs versus the dog's ears. Also, the item type is to select all that apply. So we did notice that some may have selected one of the correct answers, but they didn't select all. Or students did not pay attention to that it was asking about the puppy's ears and not just the puppy. So that was something that we saw as a common trend for this particular question. Something that we discussed as a team for teachers to be able to do to support students who didn't get this correct was once again making sure that they're reading through the question to understand what it is asking. And then also when they're seeing a select all that apply, going through each of the options to see if it does actually match what was being asked of the question. So it was twofold for that particular question. But we did notice that students who didn't get this question correct looked at either just the dogs and not the dog's ears, or they just selected one of the correct answer instead of all of the correct answers. So then it was marked incorrect. So when reflecting on what will next steps be, the team discussed that it would be nice if there were opportunities to have strategic review built into their math block. So we talked about different formats that could take place in, whether they snipped and took some of those questions and presented them again to students as an activator. That way they're able to go through and see what the real process students were taking in terms of answering the questions, what truly were those misconceptions that they had. And students are also presented with another opportunity to see the question again and get guidance on how to get the question correct. So we talked about how important it is for them to have that feedback and not just have one assessment and then after you're done with the assessment, they never see it again, especially if it was something that they needed more clarity on how to answer. So that strategic review and building that into your block. We also talked about the item type exposure. So being intentional not just for quarter assessments, but also for weekly assessments. Um, in addition to daily formal and informal assessments, having students to be able to see different item types. So one of the big ones that they were wanting to implement was drag and drop, because that question gave quite a few students um, some areas to grow within in addition to the select all that apply. So having more opportunities for them to have exposure to those type questions in their regular instruction. And then also ensuring the alignment of resources. We're fortunate in the state of South Carolina for teachers to have access to assessment specifications. The assessment specification looks at the previous year's state assessment, and it gives you insight into some areas in which students need more support. It also tells you the different types of questions that students will see in terms of DOK level ranging from 1 to 3, in addition to what type of question. So will it be a tech enhanced? Will it be a multi-select type question? So being more intentional about using that to align the rigor of the assessments for what students will see for testing. And then having focused small groups. So also knowing that a good majority of students, about 75% students, percent of students have a passing grade. So ensuring that for those students, for ones who need more skill practice, providing those opportunities. For those who need enrichment, enriching them where they need it. But for those who are still struggling, being strategic about the exposure for those students and having some focused small groups to provide extra modeling and scaffolding for them to build up their confidence and also provide models for them to see how they can go about answering those questions. And lastly, something that I'm very passionate about as a continuous improvement coordinator is always looking at the growth and progress monitoring all. And with the data reflection tool that they use, it was great for our overall look. But something that we're going to focus on, and I'll talk to you about in the next slide, is more so looking at how it looks for every specific student. So, a data analysis protocol template that I share with the team that I think would help them to better speak to data, not just holistically, but to look specifically at trends within your subgroups, especially since this school is one with a state designation for ATSI. So, one of their subgroups is showing um, areas of growth and opportunity in comparison to the whole in terms of their performance as outlined by SC Ready, the state test. I provided for them an example data analysis protocol template that takes the same questions that they had within the first one, but allows them to be more specific about how does it look whole class, and then pulling out those specific subgroups of students to seeing is it aligning, are they performing as well as other subgroups? Is there any subgroup that seems to be performing poorly, or that you do feel needs more support? This also will be key and essential as they go through and look at, weekly formative assessments and talk as a team to see, what specific strategies that they could collaborate about that may have worked in one class, may haven't worked in another class, may work with one specific subgroup of students. It could also work with another one. So I think that by being more intentional, this will give teachers the opportunity to be able to share their data and speak to it for every student in their classroom and not just giving a blanketed um, kind of report of how the data looks, but really being able to know, like, hey, as a whole, my class had a 75% average, but I still want to be more intentional about working with my pupils in poverty because it seems like only 50% of them had a passing grade. Or I really want to be strategic about working with my students with disability because I noticed only 30 to 35% of them had a passing grade. And I may want to kind of work with that resource teacher when she comes in and we be more strategic about how we can both provide them support to get them the way that they need to get. So I think this will be very helpful in their future planning. One of the first guiding questions within shared data, shared decisions was asking who was truly engaged in making their decisions when it came to data. A lot of times with data, schools tend to be reactive versus proactive. One of the biggest goals that I had when working with this team was to ensure that while we were looking at data, that we always stayed focused on how can we be proactive in terms of our instruction, our planning, our next steps to be able to support all students. So by the school already having structures in place, by having a data analysis protocol, it's a part of their culture to look at data and see how students are performing. My goal was to stretch them further and to be looking beyond just the holistic performance of the students and drilling down more to looking at a specific subgroup of students and seeing how they are progressing along as well so that we could be more intentional about looking at the individualized needs of students and being able to meet them where they are and being able to provide differentiated instruction for students to ensure that they all were successful. With data, I think Bernhardt shared it best in chapter one when talking about how with data we have to look beyond what the eyes can see. It's not about collecting more data, it's about collecting the right data. And I think what Bernhardt meant in terms of when looking across student learning, their demographic, their perception, and how the school processes data, it's important to keep in mind that there are a bunch of moving gadgets at one time, and each of those gadgets have a place. So ensuring that we're not just focusing on one particular type of data or focusing on one specific assessment, looking at how all of those interleave in together and being able to share how that data displays a student, a snapshot really, of where a student is at a place in time, but being strategic about using that snapshot to guide your next steps and how those snapshots along the way will begin to look after being provided that support. It's shared in chapter 2 of Leading Data Informed Change in Schools, the importance of the human in terms of data. A lot of times when we look at data, we think about numbers. We think about either you're showing growth or you're not. But the data is attached to students, and students are human. And who can actually make the change are those teachers who are within the room and those instructional leaders who support those teachers. So I think it's important, especially when reflecting on the work that was done within the school, that teachers had a voice. So notice a lot of times I said we reflected as a team or we reflected together because a lot of times when teachers are more engaged and they feel like they have a voice and they have that insight because they're in the classroom with students every day, they're more likely to be able to work for that change and be able to see the need uh, for the change to support support students and where they are. And it becomes something that's not done to them, but something that's done with them. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. Have a wonderful day.